All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much. The hour of 10 o'clock having arrived, we're going to go ahead and begin our Federal Affairs Advocacy Task Force. We are expecting the second member of our task force here in short order, and that's Supervisor Cortese. Let me see first if there are any speakers here under public comment. We do not. All right. We will pass by approval of the consent calendar because that does, in fact, require two members of the board to be sitting here in order to constitute a quorum, even for task force. That takes us then to item number 4, which is to receive verbal reports from the chairperson and the vice chairperson relating to items of interest to the task force. Before I go there, I do want to recognize and thank Tom Pike, who's here from Representative Rokana's office. Want to let everybody who's listening on the phone know that Representative Kana's office is represented here today. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And item 4, as I say, is verbal reports from the chair and the vice chair relating to items to interest. I think the only thing I would share this morning is that I do plan to be in Washington, D.C. In the first week of April. I'll be there for a day and a half as part of the delegation that goes back each year from the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, then spend a few extra days for additional meetings, and have already reached out to our folks at Prime about meeting with them and getting a chance to talk during that first week. So looking forward to that opportunity. And then that will take us to item number 5, which is a verbal report from the Office of the County Executive relating to items of interest to the task force. And while we always strive to be brisk in these presentations, today I would say, because it has been a little while since we have been together, there is a fair amount to report. So I want to encourage people both here in the chambers, but also those who are participating by phone, to feel like they have the time to share whatever it is they think it would be helpful to share. And the world has changed quite a bit since, at least our legislative environment has changed quite a bit since we last met, I believe, in last November. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Smith, and we'll make our way through the agenda. And as I say, we are expecting my colleague at some point here, and we'll do the official duties once he arrives. Dr. Smith?
I have one issue, and then I'll turn it over to Danielle. We, at the state level, have been negotiating with CMS regarding the upcoming waiver for Medi-Cal, Medicare. Obviously, it's very early in the process, but there seems to be some receptivity on the federal part to create a waiver that would be advantageous for the public hospitals in the state, presuming that there is performance that meets criteria. So they're thinking about things that are similar to the Prime effort, but focus on whole person care, and it's looking positive. Also related to that, we had a positive decision about graduate medical education funding, which means additional funds because we have residency programs. And there were positive decisions about EPP and QUIP, which are replacements basically for disproportionate share, what used to be disproportionate share funding. So all of those things indicate that even despite the craziness from the administration, the regulators seem to be in a mode of realizing that funding for healthcare is important. So with that, I'll turn it over to Danielle.
Thank you. Just a few points which will be elaborated on a little more when Prime Policy provides its report later on down the agenda. As you know, there's been a change in the majority party in the House, so I think that bodes for even more interesting conversations and debates than we saw last year or in the last 2 years, but also I think provides opportunity, especially on things on the agenda that are of importance to our county. There was also, which recently ended, but the longest partial government shutdown in history. We've got until February 15th for Congress and the President to come to an agreement on how to move forward for the fiscal year. Again, Prime Policy Group is going to provide a lot more information on that item. And I think that's really it for comments right now, and happy to answer others as the other agenda items are presented.
Thank you. That helps us complete item number 5 before we move on to the County Council, but let me go back and just ask Supervisor Cortese for a motion if he's amenable on item number 3, which is to approve the consent calendar and changes to the task force agenda.
So moved.
Thank you, Supervisor, and I'll second without objection, so ordered. We have covered just very brief reports on items 4 and 5, so let's go now to item 6, the Office of the County Council. And Mr. Williams, before we do that, I will just say that as I mentioned earlier, I sort of saw this meeting as a chance to kind of catch up on where we've been after having a few months since we've had our last meeting, and I went through the cases with even more care than I typically would, and again found the format very helpful and felt like I could get a handle on what we're doing on a lot of different arenas, but I'll let you take it from there. But thank you again. It's a reporting mechanism that I think is quite helpful.
I'm glad that the task force is finding that helpful, and we do have, it's published in the packet, a highlight and in red text are the updates from the last iteration of the report. But I did want to highlight just a couple things verbally for the task force. One is our net neutrality case. We had 5 hours of oral argument on Friday before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. That's an unusually long oral argument, quite unprecedented, I believe. It was a reflection of a couple factors. One is the sheer number of plaintiffs raising different issues, many, many different reasons why the FCC's repeal of the net neutrality rules was unlawful. And so the argument on behalf of the various plaintiffs was divided in different ways. Our county did present oral argument focused on the specific issue of public safety and the failure of the FCC to consider public safety issues in its decision making, even though Section 1 of the Communications Act actually mandates that the FCC consider public safety issues as distinct from economic issues. It was something that, an issue that appeared to find some traction with at least 2 of the judges on the 3-judge panel. They asked a number of public safety-oriented questions of FCC's general counsel and really highlighted the fact that the FCC really just abdicated its responsibility to even think about the public safety implications of its decision-making. That's, of course, troubling on a lot of levels in terms of how we as a local government and other state and local governments have to deal with communication and during an emergency or disaster event. But what was fascinating kind of about that conversation at oral argument is that the judges really picked up on how very practical aspects of public safety maybe could have been addressed through all sorts of different ways, but the FCC just didn't think about it, didn't think about the issue, and that's why we certainly hope that the court will vacate the decision and send it back. But the argument covered a range of other issues, everything from the fact that the FCC was trying to preempt all other state and local regulation in this space, arguments around the appropriate categorization of broadband internet, which the FCC has basically recategorized in this order under Title I, which is essentially as an information service and not as a service that's subject to common carrier regulations. And so there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of extended discussion. We will see kind of what happens. It's always dangerous to make predictions based on oral argument, but I do think that a lot of compelling arguments were put forward as to why the FCC's order was unlawful, did not comply with the Administrative Procedure Act, and needs to be sent back to the FCC.
Excuse me, just before you go on to the next item or issue, I don't know how many either in the room or on the line had the time and the inclination to watch any of the Super Bowl, but if you did, you would have seen Verizon ads prominently featuring the first responders, and it was pretty clear they were motivated to place those ads by the experience we had here in California and the accountability that we've tried to bring to the effort. So these issues manifest themselves in ways you can sometimes never imagine. I certainly never imagined that that would be one of the outcomes of the experience we had here with our own fire department. Sorry, I didn't mean to take you off track.
No, absolutely. I mean, and continues to be exactly why we're concerned about these sorts of things. And one of the points that came up in the oral argument on that was the fact that post hoc remedies, after the fact, trying to say that, oh well, there may be plan changes or something, doesn't bring back lives lost or property destroyed. And that's why you need to have an actual regulatory framework in advance to deal with the public safety issues. And so you're seeing Verizon now try to do damage control, but it doesn't solve the fact that there was that they had slowed those connections to below dial-up speed during the actual incident. On kind of other fronts, the government shutdown appears to have brought a slowing to some of the adoption of final regulations or the issuance of final regulations. Maybe it's shutdown related or not, but that's our speculation anyway. So we are awaiting final rules on a number of proposals where we had provided comment. And in many of the cases involving the federal government, stays were granted related to the shutdown. Department of Justice was one of the agencies that was affected, and civil cases obviously take lower priority than criminal cases. And so there was a slowing of a lot of activity. It depended on the specific case, depended on the decisions of the specific judges, whether they would grant a stay or not. But there were a lot of blanket stays issued, putting a hold on civil litigation involving the federal government. The couple other things that I'll report, though, related to our litigation, we continue to track and be involved in a number of cases. The big one that we're waiting on is the DACA petition to the U.S. Supreme Court. So, and this is the case where we, along with other parties, have currently a nationwide injunction keeping the DACA program in place. The Ninth Circuit upheld that injunction, and the Trump administration has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to step in and vacate that injunction. That petition has been pending. It's been heard at several conferences now of the justices at the Supreme Court. They have not yet acted on that petition request. And so we are waiting every week that they have a conference to see kind of what exactly the outcome will be. But that's one of the cases that is kind of currently still on the front burner, and we'll see kind of what the Supreme Court does. People may have seen the news that the Supreme Court recently did, by a 5-4 vote, vacate the preliminary injunction in the cases regarding the transgender ban on members of the armed forces. And so, this is a procedurally somewhat similar type of situation in the DACA case, and we'll see what the court does here. But ultimately, more cases are kind of moving their way along towards the Supreme Court. So I'm happy to answer questions, but those are, I think, the major updates.
Thank you. Supervisor Cortese, any comments or questions at this time? Thank you. All right. Well, then I think let me just flip through my notes here, Mr. Williams, real quickly. Forgive me if it went right by me. Timing on the net neutrality decision?
There's no particular deadline for the federal appellate courts to issue a decision. Given the length of the oral argument and the multitude of issues, I do not expect it'll issue very soon. I think it'll be many months before we get an opinion.
Thank you. Just that rough order of magnitude is helpful. And
I also think it'll likely be a split decision, which means it'll also take longer to issue because there'll be back and forth in terms of, you know, a possible dissent.
And I should know this, but don't, because the rules seem to be changing in a changing media market environment. But the oral arguments are accessible in any way, shape, or form, in written form, in audio form, in video form? What's the current state?
I believe, I don't know all the rules on the D.C. Circuit. We don't appear there often. I believe they've made the audio available on their website. Different courts do it differently. The Ninth Circuit makes video available. I don't believe the D.C. Circuit has video. I think it's audio that's available on their website.
I'll ask my office to check in with your office and find out. Just some of it, I'm sure, will be of interest. So thank you again on that. All right, then I think what we'll do, Supervisor Cortese, is in the absence of any other comments or questions, we'll say thank you to Mr. Williams for his report on item 6. Let me just hop back very quickly on item number 4, verbal reports from the chair and the vice chair. I did indicate I'll be spending much of the first week in April in Washington, D.C., meeting with folks in Prime, and they're on a delegation meeting. But anything you want to add or share at this time? I didn't want you to miss that opportunity if there's anything you want to offer.
Thank you. Nothing planned at this point in terms of specific efforts on my part, and nothing recent to report.
Got it. Thank you. All right. Now, item number 7, forgive me hopscotching around here, but is to receive the verbal report from Prime Policy Group relating to the federal legislative, regulatory, and administrative landscape under the current administration and Congress. And as I said earlier, we're looking forward to sort of catching up on what's happened in Washington. And Ms. Christian, I'll work through you, or we can just ask the folks at Prime if they are on the line. I did think, Supervisor Cortese, it would be helpful if we could hear from the folks at Prime a little bit about the impact of the government shutdown, if any, in terms of our county's concerns. In particular, the possibility of another shutdown is something I think we're all wondering about. Opportunities for legislative action on a bipartisan basis, and we've had some conversation about that in the past, but the climate seems to be shifting daily. And then some conversation about the efforts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act and committee assignments for our county delegations, so we know who's where, so that we can weigh in with them as appropriate. So that ought to give the folks at Prime plenty to talk about. And if we could ask you all to just introduce yourselves so we know who's on the other end of the line, that would be appreciated.
Hi, this is Erin Dorton. I'm here with Prime.
Marty Paone's here with Prime.
Elizabeth Hart-Thompson with Prime.
All right. Thank you very much. Who'd like to begin?
This is Erin. I will go ahead and start, and my colleagues will jump in and weigh in as needed. So I thought I would start with a quick recap of the government shutdown, and much of it has already been discussed, but I'll give a quick recap and the effects going forward. Government shutdowns have become increasingly common in recent years as members of both parties have opted to weaponize the appropriation process for political gains, whether perceived or otherwise. Federal shutdowns not only necessitate furloughs of several 100,000 federal employees and require cessation or reduction of many government activities, but they also affect numerous sectors of the economy. As you all know, the recent shutdown thankfully ended on January 25th with a 3-week continuing resolution to extend 2018 levels for the 25% of the federal government not already funded for FY 2019.
Ms. Dorton, excuse the interruption. If we could ask you to go just a little bit slower. I know you're trying to cover a lot of ground, but we want time to absorb this and let it sink in. Thank you.
No problem. Sure. Many federal workers and contractors, as we all know, did not get paid, and there's a known impact on the GDP and our economy, which even some within the administration acknowledge. Additionally, it seems as if there's nothing stopping the president from forcing another shutdown. While the majority of the remaining appropriations bills have already been negotiated, have passed the House and are ready to be voted on and passed by the Senate, the Homeland Security bill is still being negotiated. The conference committee is working around the clock to come up with a solution by February 15th, when the current CR runs out. It's interesting to note that the Senate Majority Leader McConnell has changed his stance, whereas during the shutdown he indicated he would not bring anything to the floor that the President would not sign. But just yesterday, on Tuesday, he noted that he has confidence in the conference committee and he hopes the President will be happy with the outcome. All that said, the President has indicated that if things do not go his way with the conference committee, he will issue a national emergency declaration regarding what he refers to as the crisis at the southern border. This action, which is unpopular even among Republicans, will cause Speaker Pelosi to bring up a resolution of disapproval. At that time, the Senate is required to bring it to the Senate floor. The resolution is privileged and only requires a simple majority vote. Judging from the most recent reports, the Senate Republicans are divided on the idea, and if the numbers are accurate, it will also pass the Senate. So why should Santa Clara County care about this? Well, the delays in funding and authorizations can have effect on programs the county cares about, several of which I will highlight now. As indicated earlier, several bills have already been negotiated and passed the House and are waiting to be voted on by the Senate and ultimately signed by the President. The Commerce, Justice, Science, Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, and Agriculture Appropriations bills are several of those, as they were extended as part of the current CR, which runs through February 15th. The numbers I will outline are agreed upon by the House and Senate, but could still be held up again by the President. So that's important to keep in mind as we discuss these numbers going forward. In the FY 2019 CJS bill, that's the Commerce, Justice, Science bill, violence against women is funded at $497 million. This level is slightly above what was provided for last year. Additionally, violence against women will also be reauthorized as part of the package that will be voted on or around February 15th. Victims of trafficking will be funded at $85 million. Regarding in the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development bills, the funding levels for the Community Development Block Grant Program is $3.3 billion, and the BUILD program is $900 million, which is about $600 less than FY 2018. In the Agriculture Appropriations bill, WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children program, is funded at $6.075 billion. SNAP is funded at $73.477 billion. Of note, regarding SNAP, you will recall during the Farm Bill negotiations, the House had work requirements in their bill, which the President supported. Ultimately, they were not included, but just last week, the USDA filed a proposed rule relating to the SNAP program and requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents. And it reads as follows. The Department proposes to amend the regulatory standards by which the Department evaluates state SNAP agency requests to waive the time limit and to end the unlimited carryover of ABAWD percentage exemptions. The proposed rule would encourage broader application of the statutory ABAWD work requirement consistent with the administration's focus on fostering self-sufficiency. The Department seeks comments from the public on proposed regulations on or before April 2nd. Lastly, of interest to the county, the extension of authorization for temporary assistance for needy families, the TANF Extension Act of 2019, which was funded in September as part of the Labor HHS bill, was extended and was signed into law in late January. I believe on January 24th it was signed, carrying it forward until June 30th. So with all of the partisan back and forth, where does this leave us with respect to the prospects for meaningful bipartisan legislation this Congress? Anything is possible, but the odds are against big bipartisan deals. Partisanship is likely to heighten, not wane, which makes political deal-making difficult and rarely mutually beneficial. All that said, with partisanship and dysfunction continuing, Speaker Pelosi is turning out to be the best person for the job in this particular moment in time. Additionally, the Santa Clara County congressional delegation in the U.S. House are well positioned to advocate for Santa Clara County's priorities as they are spread out among many committees and cover multiple areas of jurisdiction. Representative Ro Khanna is on the coveted Armed Services Committee, on the Readiness and Strategic Forces subcommittees. He also has a seat on the House Budget Committee and the Oversight and Government Reform Committees. On the Oversight Committee, he sits on the Government Operations and Economic and Consumer Policy subcommittees. Representative Anna Eshoo is the chair of the Health Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee as well, and sits on the Energy and Commerce's Communications and Technology Subcommittee. Representative Zoe Lofgren is the chair of the House Administration Committee and is also on the Judiciary and Science, Space, and Technology Committees. On the Judiciary Committee, she is chair of the Immigration Citizenship Subcommittee and also sits on Courts, Intellectual Property, and Internet subcommittees. Representative Panetta is on the Agriculture and Budget committees, and this year is a new member on the Ways and Means Committee. The Ways and Means Committee is particularly relevant today as they have jurisdiction over the Title IV-E waiver extensions, which will be discussed later at length on this call. So what does all that mean for Santa Clara County? On the positive side, the Affordable Care Act is safe for now. There may be some action on bipartisan fixes in the Affordable Care Act space to make improvements, but Speaker Pelosi will be able to curb any additional efforts for repeal. We are likely to see bipartisan action on the following issues in the healthcare space. Drug pricing. Senator Grassley has reached out to Chairman Neal and Chairman Cummins to try and find common ground on legislation. Surprise medical bills. There's a bipartisan bicameral interest in putting in protections for patients who see out-of-network providers, oftentimes in hospital settings. Senators Grassley, Cassidy, Young, Hassan, and Bennett are working together on a bill, and we know the House Committees of Jurisdiction, which are Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means, are planning a rollout of this issue and developing a bill. The opioids crisis, the bill that was passed last fall was seen as low-hanging fruit, and we expect the House and Senate to revisit this issue. Next, cuts in entitlement programs will not be on the agenda due to strong Democratic opposition in the House. And additionally, turn my page. Regarding data privacy, House Democrats will likely have momentum to push for more robust data privacy laws. There is quite a bit of legislative optimism currently regarding an infrastructure package. What that will look like ultimately with how it's paid for and what else is rolled into it remains to be seen. The authorization for Land and Water Conservation Fund, which expired on October 1st, 2018, the Senate, the Natural Resources Management Act. The bill contains a title that permanently reauthorizes the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The bill has bipartisan support, and the cloture vote on the motion to proceed was adopted by a vote of 99-1. On the less positive side, immigration reform will continue to be difficult. It's unlikely that House Democrats can reach an agreement with Senate Republicans. However, as noted before, Congresswoman Lofgren is the chair of the Immigration Subcommittee, and she has noted in the past that she hopes to bring up at least incremental reforms. Potential areas are H-1B reform, the shortage of farm workers, the detention and treatment of children, and per-country caps. Whether she's able to garner bipartisan support, however, remains unlikely.
Excuse me, Erin, what was the last item on that list of bullets in terms of incremental potential?
H-1B, shortage of farm workers, the detention and treatment of children, and per-country caps. That's what it is.
Oh, per-country caps.
Per country. Yeah.
Thank you. Got it. Just had trouble with our sound system. Thank you.
No, it could be ours too. And lastly, although there's not much appetite in the Senate and the administration, Pelosi and the House will at least turn up the volume on efforts to address climate change. it has been noted that that could be rolled into, so while it's probably not top of the agenda with the Senate and the administration, it could be rolled into part of the infrastructure package if crafted correctly. And that is all I have for now. I don't know if I've covered everything you all were interested in, but we could certainly take questions or follow up.
Thank you. Let me turn first to Supervisor Cortese, see if he's got questions or comments at this time.
None, actually. I did listen and take notes, so I appreciate the presentation.
Thank you. Let me just ask the team at Prime, the thinking or about areas where there is at least some potential for bipartisan work products, since bipartisan is the only way anything's going to get done given the split in the House and the Senate, is around drug pricing, data privacy, and infrastructure, with not much optimism about immigration reform. Is that the Cliff Notes version?
Yeah, correct. Only not on an all-encompassing immigration reform bill like the Senate passed in 2013. But as Aaron indicated, they might be able to do a piece-by-piece approach and put together coalitions that would be need, say, groups that need H-1B workers, et cetera. So there's a chance for something like that on a more limited basis, I think. The other area that is possible for, although I don't know if it matters to you all, but is this resources bill, mineral resources that is pending now in the Senate that Aaron referenced, has a land and water conservation fund in it, and it permanently authorizes that. There's bipartisan support for that, and that's probably going to get signed into law at some point too.
All right. Then I think I will just say thank you at this point, but ask you to stay with us because we're going to go to item number 8, which is a report on the federal health policy and budget landscape. And this is per our agenda through the county executive's office, but I think he's going to refer me to Ms. Christian, and I think she's going to refer me to Mr. Margolin, who we hope is on the line.
You are correct.
Thank you. So we'll go to Mr. Margolin and then ask our friends at Prime to weigh in as well so that we have the benefit of thinking from all of our folks. Mr. Margolin, you with us?
Yes, I'm with you and happy to take the double referral. So, as Prime Policy indicated, prescription drug pricing tops the list of potentials for bipartisan agreement in the health sphere. There's no question about that. The Senate, the House, the White House all seem very focused on this issue. There are dozens of ideas, and there are somewhat broad differences in approach. There are House Democrats who want to see the federal government negotiate drug prices in Medicare Part D, similar to the idea that Governor Newsom just advanced for the Medi-Cal program in California for drugs purchased through Medi-Cal, using the bulk purchasing power of government to drive down prices. Senator Grassley and Republicans less supportive of that concept, more focused on making it easier for generic drugs to come to market, very focused on price transparency. President Trump, in his State of the Union address last night, also referred to price transparency, which is a big theme of his in this realm, but also has an interest in regulation. He referred to global freeloading, which is a reference to an administration concept that the price of drugs around the world are much lower than they are in the United States, and that means that these foreign countries are, as the president likes to refer to it, freeloading, because we pay more in this country so they can pay less. And there is an administration proposal that targets Medicare Part B, the drugs administered in hospitals and doctors' offices, that would reset how that pricing is done to tie it to the average price countries around the world are paying for those drugs. So that is a regulatory approach. The administration is trying to pursue that, and we'll see where that goes. So with so many ideas out there and so much overlap, there is an excellent chance that something will happen. The Democrats in the House, I know, are somewhat optimistic that some kind of agreement will occur. Also in the area of bipartisan agreement, but sort of more predictable and more routine, are a series of bills often referred to as the extenders. These are the must-pass health funding projects like the health center, funding for health centers, National Health Service Corps. That's also tied to the deferral of the DISH cuts. They were all packaged together 2 years ago in one bipartisan push that became law. They all expire, these provisions, on September 30th of this year, and it's likely, just like 2 years ago, that some kind of bipartisan agreement will come together around these extender programs. And sometimes when those bipartisan packages are put together, other ideas can be inserted in. Again, it's a high bar for them to pass this bipartisan test, given the atmosphere in the Congress, but it is a moving vehicle that at some point will be acted on this year. The dominant health issue in the campaign last year, as we all know, was pre-existing conditions, and Congress has already begun to address that issue, at least rhetorically. There was a hearing on the House side last week with lots of finger-pointing about pre-existing conditions, who's protecting it, who's not. Much of this has been inspired by the Texas versus United States case that started last year and resulted in December in a federal district court judge ruling that the ACA had to be thrown out based upon the elimination of the penalty for the individual mandate. But the real and most immediate threat in Texas v. U.S. wasn't the whole ACA being thrown out, but it actually was the pre-existing condition protections would be lost, because those are the protections the Trump administration chose not to defend in the litigation. They backed away from defending the lawsuit that said that with the loss of the individual mandate, you can't do community rating, you can't do guaranteed issue. These are the key components of insurance regulation that make pre-existing condition protections real. And it was when they backed away from that position last year that all this talk of pre-existing conditions being at risk became inspired. So President Trump, in his speech last night, devoted a sentence to saying that we must defend pre-existing conditions and protect them, but doesn't reconcile that with the position of his administration, which is not to really intervene in the Texas case, and in fact to essentially take the position that they can legally be struck down based upon what was done with the individual mandate. There has been also some talk, and there will be talk, I'm sure, about bipartisan agreement this year on restoring stability in the insurance market. Again, with the loss of the individual mandate penalty, there's been a loss of insurance coverage in exchanges around the country, and there has been an increase in pricing for insurance products. And you may recall that when Senator Susan Collins of Maine actually voted for the tax package, which included this individual mandate provision, she was given assurances, at least by the Senate Republican leadership in the White House, that they would in fact enact stabilization legislation. That never happened because of House Republican opposition. It's now possible with the Democrats in control of the House that something could come together. But again, anything involving the ACA is so politically charged, it's hard to predict, have much confidence that an agreement can be put together. There is going to be a major oversight agenda driven by the House Democrats. There were many administrative actions last year to weaken the ACA that we've talked about in the past. These actions included not just the individual mandate penalty going away, but funding for navigators being slashed from what used to be $63 million down to only $10 million this past year. These are people who help individuals navigate the system and find access to health insurance on the exchanges. Work requirements under Medicaid, implemented now in Arkansas and resulting in the first few months of their implementation in the loss of some 17,000 covered lives in that Medicaid program. Rules to promote short-term policies and association policies that would have the net effect of encouraging healthy lives to leave the ACA exchanges and move into these other policies that don't provide the same level of protection but are less costly. So a whole series of things that have been done administratively that have weakened the ACA, but again, the ACA is far from collapse. the exchanges nationally, the .gov, US.gov, federally run exchanges did see a 4% drop in coverage. In California, we did a bit better. We only had a 2% drop. Again, it's better than a collapse. Certainly not a collapse, but not anywhere near what we wanted to see. We want these exchanges to grow, not decline. Covered California, even though we had a smaller drop in overall coverage, Covered California, our exchange, announced last week something that concerns them a great deal, and the more I've heard from them and talked to people involved with Covered California, the more I see how alarmed they are. They had a 24% drop in new enrollment. They did pretty well on renewals, but that 24% drop in new enrollment, they're saying, is attributable, they think, to the individual mandate penalty going away. And it really means that young people who are relatively healthy, if there's no penalty in place, a lot of them are saying, why do I need health insurance? And that's a disturbing trend going forward. So last comment I'll make really echoes something that Prime Policy already referenced in general terms, and that is Santa Clara County delegation, prominence, and influence. Obviously, it's a very powerful delegation in many respects, but I do want to focus on two members of our delegation who have elevated roles in the health policy sphere. First of all, Congresswoman Eshoo, who's now chair of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health, which is the place where Medicaid policy gets developed. It's a very powerful place, very powerful role in the House, and she's in that position and will have massive influence on what the House does on a whole range of health policy issues. And then Congressman Clara has emerged as a major leader on the single-payer issue, drafting legislation to facilitate Governor Newsom's plans to seek a new type of federal waiver, and leading on the authorship of single-payer legislation in the House. So he's emerging in that sphere, and I'm sure will be a powerful voice, important voice on health policy issues as well. And happy to respond to any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Prime in just a few minutes, but let me just toss a couple of clarification questions at you, if I may. You mentioned on the issue of drug pricing that there were some who were approaching that issue by virtue of talking about trying to facilitate or create a greater ease of bringing generics to market. Did I remember that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
How might that be done? So, you know, if I'm sitting here in our chambers saying, well, bringing generics to market more easily sounds like that would be a good thing, but what does that entail? What do you do to get generics to market more easily?
Well, one of the ideas that's been put out there involves making it more difficult for drug companies in some cases work out accommodations with generic manufacturers to delay or defer the point at which generics can come on market. Again, this is not an area that I'm expert in, but there's a world of negotiation and interaction between generic manufacturers and the brand manufacturers, and there are new rules that have been talked about that would make that collaboration more difficult and allow generics to come to the market more quickly. So again, I can provide you with more information if you'd like, but it's definitely an area of focus for both Senate and House members. Generic drugs is probably in the area of bipartisan agreement, maybe one of the areas of easiest agreement.
I would appreciate just a little. I'll have my office follow up with you.
Sure.
I just appreciate for my own interest. I'd like to develop a fuller understanding of what that entails.
Happy to help with that.
Thank you. And you know, it seems to me that there is I'll call it a healthy tension, in the hope that that's an accurate description, on the issue of drug pricing between those who are arguing for lower prices and sooner rather than later, and those who are arguing that in order to spur innovation and the development of life-saving drugs, you need to allow for some more significant measure of compensation over a longer period of time. Is that where you see the tension in this debate?
Yes, that is the argument traditionally that drug manufacturers have made about their need to advance their prices, keep their prices at the level they've been at. They need to do the research. They need to develop the breakthroughs. And if you create too onerous a regulatory structure and you restrict them, you will slow down the development of new life-saving drugs.
And is there any real, research that is out there that says, here's the level of return on investment that people need in order to continue to innovate? It strikes me as an easy argument to understand conceptually, but an awfully difficult one to come to any objective conclusion about.
That's a correct assessment. I think it's very hard to be objective about it. The pharmaceutical industry has spent many decades developing the argument that they need to be unfettered to the maximum extent possible because this drug development process is incredibly expensive, and there's been there are, I'm sure, lots of studies that suggest in other countries, in fact, their own industries operate much differently, and they have avoided the kind of massive escalation in prices that we've experienced. And so there are studies that counter that, but there's no simple explanation for, or there's no simple metric or agreed upon measurement that's going to allow for easy agreement. I'm sure the drug industry is going to fight these restrictions to the end, and but on the more hopeful side, in terms of a bipartisan agreement, there seems to be this Republican and Democratic assessment that the pharmaceutical industry argument that they don't need to be regulated, they shouldn't be regulated, that it'll stop life-saving drugs from coming to market is not as credible as it once was. I mean, there are Republicans, Democrats, House and Senate, and in the White House who think that there's profiteering going on and lots of price increases that really relate to stockholder returns far more than they do to the needs of research.
And let me just go back to sort of a larger issue that you referenced and that the folks at Prime referenced, and just, we spent the last 2 years worrying on an almost daily basis about efforts to simply dismantle the Affordable Care Act more or less wholesale, and of course that ultimately did not happen. There seems to be almost universal agreement that while there's going to be a lot of push and shove around the issue, that given the Democratic majority in the House, that's just not a serious threat over the course of the next 2 years. Is that a fair summary again?
Yes.
Okay.
It is not a threat.
All right. Then
Democrats will stop it.
Then let me turn to Supervisor Cortese, see if he's got any questions or comments as to your presentation, and then after that, go back to Prime and just see if we still have any other issues there on the healthcare front that we should be talking about. Supervisor Cortese, anything? Not on this item. Prime, I know you shared some earlier thoughts, and Mr. Margolin was comprehensive in his coverage, but anything else that you want to share or anything where you want to elaborate a little bit on? Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mr. Margolin did an excellent, very comprehensive job summing up a lot of the issues in the healthcare space. I will say, just food for thought, I'm a little bit less bullish on the prospect of prescription drug pricing legislation getting passed into law, and I'll just point out two main reasons why. I think that, as I've talked to professional energy and commerce and Ways and Means Committee staff, I think there's an awareness that first, at least on a committee level, both committees have sort of a historically new, large freshman class, and they need to do a lot of member education. For as talented and intelligent and sort of diverse as the new members on both committees are, a lot of them don't really have a background in healthcare policy or a large familiarity with the prescription drug pricing issue. And then I would extend that too, just to sort of the overall caucus. In my conversations with Speaker Pelosi's office, that's one of the main things that they've sort of flagged for really all of the issues in the healthcare space, which is realizing that with so many new members, they have a lot of education to do, outside of the committees, but caucus at large, and a lot of socialization of ideas before they're going to have a sense of what it is that the caucus, what direction the caucus would want to move. And then the other thing I would just point out is, Representative Eshoo actually has a reputation of being somewhat, if not fairly sympathetic to the drug industry, much more so than her counterpart, Mr. Doggett, who will be heading the Ways and Means, heading up the Ways and Means health subcommittee. And then I just think that if you sort of realize that if they're not able to sort of move something more substantial by the end of this year, moving into an election year in 2019, and this is always unfortunate, but is more frequently than not the way Washington works, I think there are going to be some political, cross pressure to not necessarily give the president, a win on an issue that would be sort of bipartisan. So I just thought I would flag those couple of data points.
All right, thank you. Helpful. Any other comments or questions from folks here at the table? All right, then if not, we will say thank you both to Mr. Margolin and his shop, and thank you to the folks at Prime, and we will move on to item number 9, which is a report on legislation regarding state flexibility for Family First Transitions Act. And Ms. Christian, do we look to you again?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
We had anticipated somebody from Social Services being here, but they are unfortunately home ill today. So in your packet, you have a written report on Senate Bill 107, which has been introduced by Senators Feinstein and Rubio. We wanted to provide information on this issue because the Title IV-E item is one of the county's federal priorities for 2019. We also had communicated at the end of 2018 with our delegation our hope that the Title IV-E waiver could be extended for a few more years. It's currently set to expire on September 30th of 2019. Our child welfare programs have operated under a Title IV-E waiver since 2014. The waiver has provided the opportunity to use federal funds more flexibly to test innovations to child welfare service delivery and financing. Our county has been able to design and demonstrate a wide range of approaches to reforming our child welfare system to improve outcomes for children, youth, and families in the areas of safety, permanency, and well-being. Your report provides some information on the results of our efforts, which appear to be promising at this time. Specifically, the average number of open cases each month has decreased by 13%. The number of youth removed from home was reduced by 8%, and the number of youth in out-of-home placements decreased by 20%. You might recall, I believe last year we shared with the task force information about the Family First Prevention Services Act, which was signed into law in February 2018 as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act. The FFPSA, which I'm just going to refer to as the Act, reforms child welfare financing streams to provide services to families who are at risk of entering the child welfare system. It aims to prevent children from entering foster care by allowing federal reimbursement for evidence-based mental health services, substance use treatment, and in-home parenting skill training. The Social Services Agency has shared that the Act presents new opportunities to support families and safely reduce the need for foster care and improve outcomes and support communities. However, key provisions of the Act become effective on October 1st, 2019, the day after our waiver ends. So with the abrupt end and then implementation or start date of the new Act, doesn't really provide for the continuation of services as we're currently doing, as well as planning and putting things into motion to be prepared to seamlessly move on over to the Family First Prevention Services Act, which could disrupt services to children and families and maybe end up with outcomes that are not as positive as what we've been seeing. So we, along with other counties in California and some other states, have been asking for the current waivers to be extended to allow for some transition time while services continue, while planning and implementation can be put into place. And that's what S107, which is the State Flexibility for Family First Transitions Act, would do. It would extend for 2 years the current waivers that are scheduled to terminate in September. Has a few other provisions to, I want to say, encourage things to be moving on, not just continue on as they are currently. It requires states to declare future measures that they will implement to improve permanency outcomes and reduce emancipation from foster care during the extended time, so during that extra 2 years. States would also be required to specify how they will transition from their projects to compliance with the Act's requirements. And the provisions will ensure that the planning and implementation of the transition from current efforts to the new Act that will be in place are efficient and seamless, again, to prevent compromising any services that are provided to children and their families. I'm happy to try to address questions on the services, but I may need to come back to you after conferring with social services.
Thank you. Actually, my question, and then I'll turn to Supervisor Cortese for comment or question, if any, is more about just where we are in the legislative process. Initially I looked at this and thought it seemed relatively complicated and daunting, and then when I sort of sifted through it all, I came to the conclusion that you just shared with us, which is, okay, we've been working with a waiver. That's been working for us. We understand we're transitioning to a new system, but we'd like a little time to make that transition a smooth and successful one. Is that kind of where we are?
Yes.
So then the question is, not on the substance, but just on the legislative environment and the politics. I note the bipartisan authorship from two, high-profile members of the Senate. Do we have any expectation or understanding about what the prospects look like for the bill to move?
Haven't had an extensive conversation with Prime Policy Group about the prospects for the bill. I will share that Aaron has been working with the lobbyists from the County of Los Angeles, and the County of Alameda has also been pretty involved, because those two counties have been operating under a waiver for a much longer length of time. And I think I know they have a whole lot more at stake, both with their services as well as their finances.
Well, as I've said before, I am always mindful of the fact that, all of Washington, D.C. is not waiting with bated breath to hear from Santa Clara County, but by the same token, if we don't raise our voices, we can't be surprised they don't get heard. So, even if it's as simple as a letter or a drop-in visit while, one of us may be in the Capitol, we'll work with your office and with Dr. Smith to sort of think through what we ought to do, because it sounds to me like the impact could be pretty dramatic if the transition time is not forthcoming.
Yes, and again, just to share, this issue is one of the federal priorities that the board recently approved. So that information is being communicated to members of our delegation. At the end of 2018, we did send a letter asking our delegation to support efforts. The County of Los Angeles was trying to do before the government shuts down, let's extend Title 4E effort, which didn't happen then, but now we have a new path. Again, we communicated our hope that could happen, and we're communicating support for the Senate bill as well.
Great. Thank you very much. And if there are ways we can be helpful, please ask.
Thank you.
I see Mr. Pike leaning in before I go to Supervisor Cortese. Yes.
Yeah, just real quick. And from Congressman Khanna's office, I'll flag that with our DC staff and make sure that on the House side they're doing what they can.
Thank you very much. Supervisor Cortese, comments or questions on this item?
No, thank you. We've been tracking this at the board and at the CSFC committee as well, so I appreciate the update. Thank you.
Good. And again, I'll just reiterate, let us know if there's something tangible we can do to just add our voice to the chorus of folks who have expressed a similar point of view. All right, well, that completes item number 9, and we have already covered our consent calendar, so I believe that wraps it up for the day. We'll say thank you to any who are still on the line with us, as well as those who are here today. Without objection and hearing none, we are adjourned until our next meeting, and that is scheduled on our calendar. Thank you all.